This tourist thought she could disrespect the royal guard. She was wrong. Welcome to our channel. We're thrilled to have you here. Today's story will leave you on the edge of your seat, filled with suspense and unforgettable moments. But before we dive in, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. It's always exciting to see how far our stories reach. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our next thrilling episode. Coming tomorrow. Get ready for another amazing journey. Let's get started. It was a crisp late afternoon at Horse Guard Parade, the historic square nestled near Buckingham Palace. The crowd was gathering, their cameras snapping photos of the iconic British Royal Guards. The sun cast long shadows over the cobblestone ground, creating a picture-perfect scene. Tourists from all over the world had gathered, their excitement palpable as they waited to witness the timeless spectacle of Britain's finest soldiers standing sentry. The air was filled with a sense of reverence, as well as the hum of whispered conversations, explaining the importance of the guards to children and tourists alike. Everyone knew what to expect. The impeccable uniforms, the stoic expressions, the utter stillness of the guards. But no one truly understood the depth of the discipline required until they saw it firsthand. Among the crowd, Staff Sergeant Michael Bennett stood unwavering, perfectly still at his post. At 32, Bennett had already served in multiple combat zones. His chest bore the medals of a soldier who had earned his place on the front lines. 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. Yet most of the tourists, unaware of the significance of those decorations, simply saw him as a living statue. They marveled at his uniform, a striking scarlet tunic paired with a towering bearskin cap, which made him look as though he had stepped out of a history book. His posture was flawless, his white-gloved hands firmly gripping the L-85A2 assault rifle, which was carefully positioned against his shoulder. His gaze was steady, fixed on a distant point, as if he had become part of the surrounding architecture, blending in with the history of the palace behind him. But behind the stillness was a sharpness in his eyes, an awareness honed by years of military training. Bennett knew the significance of this post. His role wasn't just about standing motionless for tourists to take their photos. It was about duty, tradition, and a commitment to the crown that ran deeper than any uniform. He wasn't here to entertain. He was here to protect, to uphold the legacy of those who had stood before him. His mind remained alert, focused on every movement in the crowd, every small shift that could indicate danger or disruption. The tourists, however, didn't always understand. Most respected the boundaries that were clear to them, the ropes, the guards' immobility, the unspoken rule, that they were not to disturb, but not everyone was so mindful. Among the crowd, one woman stood out. With a sharp, commanding voice, she pushed her way through, elbowing her way past a few startled onlookers. "Excuse me, move," she said, her tone cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. She was an American, dressed in an expensive designer outfit, her hair perfectly styled. Her voice carried an unmistakable edge of entitlement. "I didn't fly all the way from the States to stand at the back," she added, her words dripping with disdain. As she shoved her way through, the elderly couple nearby shifted reluctantly to make way, the man steadying his wife, who nearly lost her balance. The woman didn't even acknowledge the disruption she was causing. "Honestly, the service in this country is appalling," she continued, her voice rising in irritation. "First, no upgrades at the hotel, and now this circus where I can't even get a decent picture." She pushed her way forward, clearly irritated by the ropes that separated her from the guard. "What is this, a joke?" she muttered to herself, as she eyed Bennett, who stood resolutely at his post. Despite the mounting disruption, Bennett remained unfazed, his discipline unbroken. He had dealt with tourists like her before, those who saw the guards as little more than props for their selfies. But this woman's behavior was different. She was relentless, determined to get a perfect shot no matter the cost. And though Bennett's posture remained unchanged, his mind was already anticipating the next move. He knew this wasn't just about her photo. It was about something deeper, the disrespect, the assumption that his role was one of amusement, not of duty, The woman stepped closer, continuing her tirade. Bennett stayed focused. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew that as a soldier it was his duty to remain composed, no matter what distractions came his way. But there was something about this woman's behavior that pushed the boundaries, something that would soon lead to a confrontation. He wasn't just standing there, he was upholding centuries of tradition, and that, in itself, demanded respect. Karen, however, didn't care about the boundaries or the history. She was determined to get what she wanted. The more Bennett stood there, unyielding and silent, the more she seemed to grow agitated. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the area, clearly upset that she wasn't able to get the perfect shot. It was as if her sense of entitlement had reached its peak. With a huff, she muttered to herself, "Ridiculous. This is such a waste of time. I paid good money for this, and they can't even let me get close enough for a decent photo?" The crowd around her began to shift uneasily. A few exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with her behavior. Some whispered to each other, but no one dared confront her directly. She wasn't the type to be reasoned with. Then, as if to prove a point, she stepped right under the rope, crossing the clearly marked boundary. The tourists around her gasped, but she didn't seem to notice or care. The security officer, already approaching, slowed his pace, not wanting to escalate the situation just yet. Karen didn't even acknowledge the officer's presence. Instead, she lifted her expensive camera, angling it toward Bennett. Her voice was louder now, demanding attention. "Do you even do anything, or is this all just for show?" she said, her words slicing through the air like a knife. "I've seen better performances at Disney World. At least their actors smile for pictures." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some visibly flinching at her lack of respect. The elderly couple that had earlier moved aside seemed to regret their decision, their eyes shifting to the security officer, hoping for him to step in. Bennett remained still, his face unreadable. He had heard it all before. Tourists who didn't understand, who saw the guards as part of the spectacle and not as active duty soldiers. But Karen's behavior was different. She wasn't just unaware. She was mocking the very tradition he stood for, demeaning the discipline he had spent years mastering. His gaze never wavered. But inside, his training kicked in. He had dealt with plenty of distractions before, but something about her audacity pushed him to the edge. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Karen called out, stepping closer to him, her voice cutting through the air. She was now standing less than a foot away, staring him down, daring him to respond. The crowd fell silent, watching intently, knowing something was about to happen. The tension hung thick in the air. The security officer, who had been approaching slowly, now stood frozen, unsure how to proceed. He could see where this was headed, but there was something about the scene that felt almost inevitable. Karen raised her voice even louder, her words dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, look at that. The big strong man just standing there like a robot. I bet you can't even smile, can you?" She was now so close that she could almost reach out and touch his face. Bennett's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression never changed. His discipline was unwavering. Then, as if to test him, Karen reached out, her fingers hovering near the rifle Bennett was holding. "I bet if I offered you $100 you'd smile for my picture, wouldn't you?" She laughed mockingly, her hand moving closer to his weapon. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, sensing the tension mounting. The security officer, now only a few feet away, quickly stepped forward, his voice firm, yet professional. "Ma'am, I need you to step back behind the barrier," he said, his tone growing urgent. But Karen, consumed by her desire for a perfect shot, ignored him completely, her hand still hovering just inches from Bennett's rifle. And then, in an instant, everything changed. With a precise and controlled motion, Bennett pivoted on his heel, his boots striking the cobblestone with the force of a military command. His white-gloved hands held firm to the rifle, and with a sudden, sharp movement, he stepped into a position that made Karen stumble back, her hand now mere inches away from the barrel. "Step back from the Queen's guard," he commanded, his voice booming across the courtyard, carrying the weight of 15 years of military authority. The crowd froze. A hush fell over the area, the once bustling sound of tourists silenced by the sheer power in his voice. Karen, her face flushed with shock, took an unsteady step back, her designer sunglasses askew, her bravado evaporating in an instant. She had thought she was playing a game, mocking a soldier who couldn't respond. But now, standing face to face with the very embodiment of military discipline, her confidence crumbled. For a moment, Karen's eyes widened, and her lips parted. In disbelief, she had made a grave mistake, and it was too late to take it back. The security officer, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, moved quickly to intervene. But it was clear that this wasn't just a confrontation. It was a moment of undeniable power, a reminder that respect for tradition, for duty, and for the men who served was not something to be taken lightly. The crowd stood in stunned silence as Karen's actions escalated. Her earlier bravado had turned into something far more dangerous, a reckless disregard for the rules that governed not just the guards, but the very fabric of respect that upheld the country's traditions. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping, over her heels as the realization of her mistake began to sink in. The air felt thick with tension, the spectators around her holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. But Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. Her eyes were wide, but her anger hadn't subsided. She was embarrassed, yes, but her pride was far more wounded. For a moment, it seemed like she might step back and retreat, but instead, she bristled, the rebellious streak in her that had driven her this far flaring up once more. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and she hated it. The shame threatened to choke her, but her need to prove something, to show that she was in control, pushed her forward. "Is that all you've got?" she snapped, raising her chin, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her stomach. "You think that's enough to intimidate me?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. But it was clear she wasn't speaking to Bennett anymore. She was speaking to the crowd, trying to regain the upper hand in the face of her own fear. Staff Sergeant Bennett, however, remained as still as ever, his gaze unwavering. The rifle was firmly in his hands, and though his body remained locked in the traditional posture of the Royal Guard, there was an intensity in his eyes now, a quiet strength that betrayed his stoic appearance. He had been patient, disciplined, but now there was a new air of authority that he exuded. This wasn't just about tradition. This was about his duty to protect, to uphold the standards that had been in place for centuries. The security officer had already taken several steps toward Karen, his voice firm as he spoke, but Karen wasn't listening. "You can't just stand there and ignore me," she yelled. "I'm a paying tourist. I deserve respect." Her words were desperate, raw with frustration, and yet there was no sign of self-awareness in her. She couldn't see that respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, and she was losing it by the second. Bennett's voice cut through the air with the precision of a seasoned soldier. "Step back. Now," he commanded, his voice low but carrying the full weight of his years of military experience. The crowd, which had once been wary, now stood in awe of the power in his tone. Even the security officer paused, momentarily taken, aback by the strength of Bennett's command. There was no hesitation, no room for argument. He had already given her a warning, and now there would be no more games. His voice wasn't just that of a soldier. It was a man who had faced real danger, who had stood tall on battlefields far away, and who had seen what happened when people forgot the importance of discipline. Karen hesitated. Her heart raced, her mind running through 100 thoughts. But the reality of the situation began to settle in. She had crossed a line, and now she was facing the full force of the Guard's military discipline. For the first time, she looked into Bennett's eyes, and for the first time, she saw the soldier behind the uniform, the years of experience and service, the man who had earned his place. This wasn't a game. This wasn't an actor. This was a real soldier, one who had faced danger, one who had sacrificed for the very freedoms she had taken for granted. Her defiance faltered as she stepped back, but it wasn't out of respect. It was out of fear. Fear of the consequences she hadn't fully understood until now. The crowd remained still, the tension hanging thick in the air. Karen's hand lingered for a moment, but then she let it drop. The realization that her actions had been wrong settled over her like a heavy fog. The cocky, entitled woman who had barged past everyone, who had mocked the guards, was now retreating, defeated by her own lack of understanding. Bennett, without saying another word, stamped his foot once more. The sharp sound echoed through the courtyard, signaling that the situation was resolved. His rifle remained firmly in place, his posture as perfect as it had been before Karen's outburst. The crowd, once nervous, now seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The respect for the guards, once questioned by Karen, was now evident in every face in the crowd. But as Karen was escorted away by the security officer, her gaze still locked on Bennett, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside her. She had come here to mock, to belittle, and now she was the one who had been humbled. The weight of her actions was finally beginning to hit her, and the truth was undeniable. She had misjudged the situation entirely. And though she wouldn't admit it to anyone, she had learned something that day. Respect wasn't just for show, it was earned, and it could be lost in an instant. The air grew thick with tension as Karen stumbled back, her heart racing. She had crossed a line, and she knew it, though she was too proud to admit it. Her hand had come dangerously close to grabbing the rifle, to disrespecting the very core of military tradition. But somehow, in the split second before her fingers made contact, something changed. The intensity of Bennett's presence seemed to pierce through the chaos, his steady gaze locking onto hers, like the calm before a storm. And in that moment, Karen realized just how much she had underestimated him, and the power of the situation. Bennett's military discipline was unshakable, his years of training evident in every motion. She was no longer dealing with a statue, a soldier who stood frozen for tourist entertainment. She was facing a man, a soldier, who had seen the horrors of combat and had been molded by it. The rifle she had so carelessly mocked was not a prop, it was a real weapon, carried by a real soldier. As her fingers inched closer to the weapon, Bennett's body shifted, faster than she could process. In one swift movement, his boots hit the cobblestones with a resounding force, his rifle still firmly in hand. It was an act of precision, military-grade execution in the blink of an eye. Without warning, he spun, pivoting 90 degrees, his white-gloved hands maintaining their grip on the rifle, which remained in his possession despite her futile attempt to wrench it away. The power in his movement was undeniable. "Step back from the Queen's Guard," Bennett's voice boomed, cutting through the courtyard like a shockwave. His words echoed, carrying the full force of 15 years of military authority. Karen froze, her body instinctively pulling away as his commanding voice reverberated through her. She had been bold, defiant, but now the reality of what she had just tried to do hit her like a ton of bricks. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Karen, once full of arrogance and bravado, now stood before Bennett, her sunglasses askew, her confidence shattered. Her breath caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, her feet losing their footing for just a second. The crowd, once a blur of faces, was now eerily silent. Every eye was on her, waiting, watching, waiting for her next move. But there was no fight left in her. The power of Bennett's command, his unyielding discipline, had done what no one else could, had broken her sense of entitlement. For the first time since she'd arrived in London, Karen felt small, insignificant, and utterly out of her depth. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her mind, leaving her speechless. She had mocked a man who had earned the right to stand in that position, who had fought for the very freedoms that allowed her to travel across the world, who had placed himself in harm's way for others. And she had tried to diminish him, reduce him to a mere spectacle. Bennett's movements were calm, controlled, each one a deliberate action rooted in the centuries-old traditions he represented. His posture returned to the perfect still form that had become a symbol of the British Royal Guard, as if nothing had happened. But the air had changed. The intensity of the moment was palpable, and Karen knew she would never look at the guards the same way again. The security officer, who had been approaching at a slow pace, now quickened his steps, his voice firm and professional as he approached Karen. "Ma'am, I need you to step back behind the barrier. Now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But Karen wasn't listening anymore. She stood there, still trying to gather her thoughts, but her defiance had evaporated, replaced by a cold, uncomfortable realization. She had made a mistake, a big one. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, their collective disapproval thick in the air. And it wasn't just the tourists. It was the veteran who had warned her earlier, his voice now filled with a quiet authority that made her shrink in shame. It was the silent respect for Bennett, the understanding that she had just come face to face with the true meaning of discipline. The officer's firm grip on the situation pulled her from her thoughts. "You need to leave, ma'am," he said, his tone now carrying an edge of finality. But Karen, her pride barely holding on, was not ready to walk away just yet. "I didn't mean to," she began, but her words faltered in her throat. She couldn't finish the sentence. She had crossed a line, and no amount of words could undo what had just happened. The weight of her actions finally settled on her shoulders, heavier than the luxury handbag she had so carelessly used to push her way to the front. She was no longer just a tourist. She was someone who had disrespected the very traditions that defined a nation, and she knew that no apology could undo that. As Karen was escorted away by the officer, Bennett resumed his post, his presence as commanding and disciplined as ever. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their murmurs filled with disbelief and the understanding that they had just witnessed something far more profound than a mere tourist attraction. Karen, her head bowed in shame, was led out of the courtyard. For the first time, she noticed the soft murmurs of respect for the guards, the hushed conversations that followed her. She had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that respect wasn't something to be taken for granted. It had to be earned, and when it was lost, it could be impossible to regain. As Karen was escorted away, her mind was spinning, but not with the pride and defiance she had felt earlier. No. Now she was drowning in the reality of what she had just done. The crowd's whispers followed her, but she barely registered them. She had wanted to prove a point, to make a spectacle, but all she had done was expose her ignorance. She had come to this historic place expecting a simple photo op, a casual experience, but instead, she had collided with something far bigger than herself. The security officer guided her out of the courtyard, his steps deliberate, the air between them thick with the tension of the confrontation. She glanced back over her shoulder one last time, her eyes locking with Bennett's for a fleeting moment. His posture was once again perfect, a soldier at attention, his rifle still firmly held. It was like nothing had happened. But for Karen, everything had changed. The weight of her actions was pressing down on her chest, her breath shallow as she tried to compose herself. Her husband, Harold, had retreated earlier, his face buried in a guidebook, clearly trying to avoid the confrontation. But now, as she walked past him, she could feel his eyes on her, the judgment in his gaze. He didn't speak, but the silence between them was louder than any words could have been. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. It was about respect, and how easily that could be lost. The police officers led her to a waiting vehicle, their presence a stark reminder of the seriousness of her mistake. Karen's mind raced. She had mocked the soldiers, disrespected the traditions they represented, and now there would be consequences. She tried to explain herself, but the words seemed hollow, even to her own ears. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she mumbled, but there was no one to hear her. The officers were already on their radios, contacting the embassy, securing the necessary paperwork. There was no turning back now. And then, in the midst of it all, came a voice from behind her, a voice she hadn't heard before. It was calm, measured and full of authority. The elderly veteran who had tried to warn her earlier stepped forward again, his bearing unwavering. Despite his age, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen much more than Karen ever would. "Excuse me," he said, turning to the officers. "I served 30 years in Her Majesty's forces. I think I can shed some light on this situation." His voice was soft, but it carried a gravity that commanded attention. The officers nodded, allowing him to speak, though Karen could feel her frustration building. Who was this man to lecture her now? The veteran looked at her with a quiet intensity, his eyes hardening as he addressed Karen directly. "What you did today was disrespectful," he said, his tone not angry but deeply disappointed. "These men," he gestured to Bennett, still standing firm in the courtyard, "are not your toys. They're not here for your amusement. They're here to serve, to protect, to uphold a tradition that goes back centuries. And you," he paused, his gaze hardening, "you tried to disrespect that." Karen bristled at his words, the sting of his condemnation cutting deep. "I didn't know it was that serious," she stammered, though she knew it was no excuse. The veteran shook his head, the disappointment in his eyes deepening. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "You didn't know, but that doesn't make your actions any less harmful. These men, these soldiers, they don't just wear uniforms for show. They stand at these posts to protect the very traditions that make this country what it is. And you mock them, all for a picture." Karen felt her face flush with shame. The veteran's words weren't just an accusation. They were a truth she couldn't deny. She had assumed that everything was a performance, a spectacle, but she was wrong. And now she was paying the price. The officers, having listened patiently, exchanged glances. One of them, a young officer, spoke up, his tone more sympathetic than Karen expected. "Ma'am, we understand you may not have known the full gravity of the situation," he said. "But that doesn't change the fact that interfering with an active duty soldier is a serious offense. You've disrespected not just a man in uniform, but the very tradition he represents." His words were firm, but there was a hint of empathy in his voice. "The Crown Prosecution Service will review the evidence and determine the next steps, but this isn't something we take lightly." Karen nodded numbly, her mind still reeling. She had been so sure of herself, so confident in her actions, but now she felt small. The veteran had reminded her of something she had forgotten: the weight of history, the importance of respect, and the consequences of disregarding both. As the officers escorted her to the waiting vehicle, Karen took one last look at the courtyard, at Bennett, still standing like a pillar of discipline. And for the first time, she understood. She understood the honor behind the uniform, the years of sacrifice, and the duty that came with it. And she realized, far too late, how deeply she had misunderstood everything. "We want to hear from you." After experiencing this powerful story, take a moment to share your thoughts with us. What did you think of Karen's actions and the way she was confronted by the Royal Guard? Do you believe her reaction was a result of ignorance, or was there a deeper sense of disrespect for tradition? And how do you feel about the role of discipline and respect in today's society? We love reading your comments, and your perspective matters to us. Whether you agree or disagree, your voice adds to the conversation and helps us create more engaging and meaningful content. So, don't be shy. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, your thoughts on the story, or even your own experiences with respecting traditions in different cultures. Also, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories just like this one. Every comment, like, and share means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you the stories that matter most. We can't wait to hear your thoughts. Let's keep the conversation going.